You're on the Bible Forum. It's Sunday night. We're in the midst of a shutdown. Here, the last Sunday in March of 2020. There's an 8.3 billion with a B House bill making the rounds. The bill is looking for $500 billion in direct payments to people. This is what the House was projecting for the coronavirus thing. 2 waves of checks up to $1,200, individuals earning up to $75,000. Additional payments for families with children could push the total to $3,000 for a family of 4. That according to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. There is up to $500 billion in liquidity assistance for distressed industries. The amount allocates up to $61 billion for passenger and cargo airline contractors, including $32 billion in grants and $29 billion in loans. Some $350 billion in loans to small businesses, according to Republican Senator Rubio, chairman of the Senate Small Business Committee. Up to $130 billion for hospitals. Republicans said on Monday they have agreed to $75 billion. Hospitals were looking for $100 billion, and Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer said on a conference call Tuesday he believed Democrats had secured $130 billion. Some $250 billion for expanding unemployment insurance. Republicans said they would agree to that in response to the Democrat demands. Over $10 billion for drug development, $4 billion for masks, gloves, gowns, and ventilators. Schumer expressed confidence that Democrats had secured $150 billion for state and local governments. The White House has proposed $45.8 billion for federal agencies. Both Democrats and Republicans want more. This comes to a total of $1.5 trillion. At the same time, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi unveiled her proposal on Monday. It was for $2.5 trillion, a full $1 trillion more. It included billions to help states conduct elections by mail. Pelosi's bill would also make coronavirus treatment free for patients and raise the direct cash payments to individuals to $1,500 each instead of $1,200. Pelosi's proposal has $500 billion in grants and loans for small businesses, $200 billion for state governments, $15 billion for local governments, $150 billion for hospitals, $60 billion for schools and universities, $61 billion in grants and loans for airlines. But it does require air carriers receiving aid to cut their carbon emissions in half over the next 30 years. And that's just the summary. The devil, as they say, is in the details. The question becomes, where does all this money come from? As a nation, we are already in debt to the tune of $23.5 trillion. We have tax revenues bringing in $3.5 trillion. And a projected gross domestic income of just under $22 trillion. Our debt to GDP ratio is 124%. You try living that way. See how long you last. But then you can't just print money, can you? If our government had to live the way you do, it would provide a proper illustration called leadership. Our taxes would be much smaller. People would be motivated to work if they wanted to eat. Crime would go down given the basic values of population, meaning no one would put up with it. People who stole from productive citizens would be required to replace what they stole, plus 20%. If they could not, then they would be sold into slavery to the one for whom he stole. Slavery? Yeah. That's the biblical penalty. Leviticus chapter 6. Under the Old Testament law, it was a good system. Presumably until the debt is paid, people became what are called indentured servants. In the early days of the American colonies, half to two-thirds of the immigrants who came across the Atlantic to the American colonies arrived as indentured servants. They sold themselves into slavery. What they got in return was a trip over here. And of course, they had to work for the person who paid for them. These servants typically worked 4 to 7 years in exchange for their passage, their room, their board, lodging, freedom, dues. Often 25 acres of land, a year's worth of corn, arms, a cow, and new clothes were given to them at the end of their 7-year period. While the life of an indentured servant was admittedly harsh and restrictive, it still wasn't slavery. These people chose to live this life, generally because this was the only way they could accumulate wealth or pay off a debt. And the colonies were offering opportunities. There were laws that protected some of their rights. But their life was not easy, and the punishments meted out to people who did wrong were harsher than those for non-servants, meaning employees. For example, an indentured servant's contract could be extended as punishment for breaking a law, such as running away, or in the case of a female servant, becoming pregnant. The issue here was personal responsibility. These people wanted something, they went to people who had the means, and they did the only thing they could do. But then they had to live according to the result for the allotted time. It's called character. And in their mind, it was completely fair. They were getting a great deal for this 7 years of their life. Today we look back on that, and very often we look back on it in disdain. It was terrible what these people did. They volunteered for it. You know, by the way, there were many black folks who were indentured servants as well. Not every one of them came over here as a slave, captured and sold. Many of them bought their way out. We read our history. Sometimes we don't read close enough. It was a difficult time, but it was a different time. We might get back to it again if we keep going.